ahead and get this webinar started. I'm Sandy Fowler, President of SIETAR USA. I'm trusting that everyone who is on can hear me. I'm wanting to say good morning and welcome. Welcome to the October webinar for SIETAR USA. I'm so pleased that we have such a great group. It's one of our largest so far. In fact, it is the largest. We have not had as many people as I can see are on already, 44 of you. I'd like to go through a few instructions first, and then I will introduce our speaker. The thing that we like to do is we have our presentation first and a Q&A afterward. So if you have questions, you can hold them, and at the time of the question and answer period, please put your questions into the chat room at that time. We may not have time to get up to all of the questions because of all of the people. So what I'm going to suggest is that Neal has agreed that he would answer questions by email, and so go ahead and put your questions in. If we don't get to you, you'll hear from him later. So I have the other thing that I need to say is we are recording this webinar, and that's because we want people who have not been able to get on because of other commitments to be able to hear what the webinar content for today and what Neal has to say. I have the pleasure of introducing an old friend. I've known Neal for many years, and in fact, it goes back to the days of SIETAR International. But what I'd like you to know about him is that he was the founder and president of He's an internationally recognized authority on intercultural relations, diversity and inclusion, and organizational development. He's spent a lifetime promoting intercultural understanding through his research, his writing, his activism, and academia. And his students have been the beneficiaries of his teaching over so many years. He is Professor Emeritus at St. Peter's University. He's a proud member of SIETAR and has been since 1978. And he was a recipient in 1995 of the SIETAR International Senior Interculturalist Award for lifetime contributions to the intercultural field. And he's continued contributing ever since. He's very proud of his 2 daughters, and he has 4 grandchildren, and his beautiful wife, Varda, comes with him very often to the SIETAR conferences. So I've gotten to know Varda as well, and I enjoy both of them. And I know you'll enjoy this morning when Neal talks to you about unconscious bias. Neal, you're up.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Sandy. I really appreciate it. And yes, we're good friends. I wouldn't say old friends, but good friends for sure. Anyway, welcome from multicultural Miami. Miami is the unofficial capital of Latin America. It's a very, very multicultural environment, which is one of the reasons I chose to move here. Anyway, I wanted to preface my remarks by saying that in the event that I say anything that might be construed as offensive to anybody attending the webinar, please let me know after the webinar. We're all likely to say something unintentionally offensive, and we can only learn by having people draw that to our attention. And I'm always trying to learn more. So please let me know after the seminar if I said anything at all that could be implied to be negative towards anyone. Anyway, I'd like to begin by showing you a couple of slides of a couple of headlines. So this is the first headline, and this actually goes back to 1963. when I led my first bias elimination programs. And the next slide, and by the way, they spelled my name wrong there. And the next slide, that's from 2019. So as you can see, I've been trying to build a more equitable and inclusive environment for about 56 years now, and I'm still trying to figure it out and how to get it right. We're always on a learning journey, and I'm really happy to learn from all of you out there as well. I'm really honored to be delivering this program to my fellow interculturalists, as you and I share a common legacy. You are the link between our past and our future. And you have an awesome responsibility to create a better world than the one that you found, which is, I'm sure, why many of you joined SIETAR. As Sandy mentioned, I've been an activist, a social psychologist, a professor, a SIETAR loyalist, an entrepreneur, and a troublemaker almost all of my life. I was doing disruption, I guess, before there was such a term. I will say that the best part of being an interculturalist for me has been all of my fellow interculturalists that I've had a chance to meet and learn from and share ideas with. I'm extremely proud of the fact that many of the interculturalists I've gotten to know have joined Global Dynamics as associates, and these my associates really are what makes our organization work effectively. They are some of the top cross-cultural specialists and diversity trainers I know, and they all inspire me and enlighten me with their wisdom. And I learned so much from attending some of the workshops that we run. Very briefly about Global Dynamics, very simply, we focus on three main areas. We've been around since 1983, and we focus on cultural competence, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and virtual workforce effectiveness. And I'm very proud to say that we have clients who are headquartered on 4 continents. So we're really not a US-centric company, because a lot of our clients are actually headquartered all over the world. And our mission is very simple: helping to build globally inclusive organizations. Very simple, but that's really what we're all about. And now I'd like to learn something about you. So we have a few questions for you. So first question is there anyone from outside the US attending this webinar, and where are you from? You can put that in chat. We'll get a quick response to that. And by the way, joining me is Dana Klein, our Vice President for Programming. And Dana is a essential, critical part of our organization.
Yes, hello everybody. Neal, I see there's people joining us here from Canada and India. Someone from Thailand, but they're currently in Florida. Someone in Ireland. We have a French national, but who's here in US currently. Somebody from the Netherlands.
I saw Hungary also. Yep.
Yeah, that's great. So we do have a
fantastic
nice disbursement of people from all over.
Fantastic. Well, let's go. I'd like to continue to learn more about you. So we're going to do a quick little poll here. It's really quite simple. We want to know how many of you are working in education, government, corporations, or consultants, or other. And if you could just fill that in and submit your results, we'll do that really quickly.
And people are entering in. We'll give a couple more seconds. And I'm going to close the polling now.
Okay, so we have 34% in education, no one from government, 3% from corporate, and 61% consultants, and then 26% others. So what are some of the others? If you can put that in chat, I'm just curious to see what some of the others are. Students or something else? Nonprofit, okay. Community, healthcare, mishmash. Nonprofits, disability rights, international development, great. NGOs, new opportunities, nonprofits, scholarship program, fantastic. Okay, well, it's always good to get to know everybody and find out what's really driving you. And so let's go to what you're currently doing. How many of you are currently delivering unconscious bias programs already? That'd be the second poll. A poll should be coming up in a second. There we go. So if you could please respond to the poll, we'll do this real quickly. Okay, so here's what we have. We have about almost 40% currently delivering it, 13% not, and 50% not currently, but would like to. Wonderful. Well, welcome to all of you. I hope we'll be able to meet your needs and expectations in the next hour or so. So let me begin with the program and go to the next slide. You can close the poll.
Neal,
Can we close the poll to see the slide?
The poll is closed.
I'm seeing it on my screen.
I'm sorry.
There we go. Okay. So I want to start with the business case for diversity and inclusion and unconscious bias training. And there are literally hundreds and hundreds of articles out there talking about the importance of diversity and inclusion for organizations. And you know, one of the best studies done out there was this McKinsey report, which showed that 15% that gender diverse companies outperform their competitors by 15%, and ethnically diverse companies outperform their competitors by 35%. And also in that study, they said that when you combined diversity to perceived inclusion, the benefits are even greater in terms of profits, employee engagement scores, employee loyalty. They said there are just hundreds of articles. If you need them, just Google them, you'll see them all. But we do know that more diverse organizations are more innovative, more creative, have much greater engagement. And while working in a diverse scenario takes a bit more mental energy, it certainly does, but that's the whole benefit of it, is you have to work a little bit harder to get to learn about everybody, but then you get the benefit of everybody's wisdom. And throughout my life, I've learned the very most from people who are different from me, not from people who are like me. Unconscious bias training is important to business and to everybody, really, because unconscious bias training should result in more rational and thoughtful decision-making, resulting in more successful outcomes. For example, one of our clients is a private equity fund in the biosciences. And they called us because they said people would come in to make pitches for them to invest, you know, millions of dollars on projects. And the question is, what would be their unconscious bias? Why would they need unconscious bias training? What they explained to us was, you know, they would typically apply less rigid standards for investing with older white males who graduated from elite universities than they would if the person who's pitching to them was a younger non-white female. And they realized this after they lost out on investing in a product that was pitched by a female scientist, which became a $300 million company. And they realized, gee, we lost there because we had bias against the situation because we judged her as a female and younger, and et cetera, and non-white. And they said, you know, if this was an older male, we probably would have accepted it. So that's why they needed the training. So there is definitely a business case to be made for this. I'd like to, go next to the concept of diversity and inclusion.
Yes, but I don't want them to hear me.
Hello? Okay, so when we talk about diversity, what comes to mind? Many people think of diversity as only referring to race or gender or age. In its broadest context, diversity is the unique characteristics or differences that each of us have, including, among other things, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, age, physical abilities, religious beliefs, neurodiversity, political beliefs, personality types, and much, much more. We have to realize that when we think of diversity, it's so much of it is socially defined based on where we're living. So, and if we look at inclusion, we'll see that, inclusion is this idea that it's creating a welcoming environment that accepts each individual's difference, embraces strengths, encourages involvement, and provides equal opportunities and information for all to achieve their full potential. We can have diversity without inclusion, but we can't have inclusion without diversity. Diversity is reality, and inclusion is a choice. Diversity is how we hire, and inclusion is how we manage. And one other point about diversity, and that is simply that we don't belong to just one category. When it comes to bias, there are often a combination of factors facing individuals. This is called intersectionality. And intersectionality is the idea that identities such as race, gender, sexual orientation, social class, disability, and age overlap and intersect in dynamic ways that shape an individual's experience. Here in Miami, for example, Hispanics who are dark-skinned are more likely to be stopped by police than Hispanics who are light-skinned. And then if you add in factors such as gender and age, you can see how intersectionality can affect somebody's lives. Okay, we're going to do two quick polls now about bias, and we'd like you to answer these. So you'll see the first one is our biases always have negative consequences, and the second one has true or false, does having a bias make you a bad person? So please enter your answers right now, and then we'll look at the results. Okay, well, looks like we're very close. Yeah, if you answered negatively or no to both questions, then you're correct. For our purposes today, we're going to define bias as any thought or action, intentional or unintentional, that provides someone with an unfair advantage or disadvantage. It's important to remember that bias can be positive or negative. Often it's thought of only as negative. Many people are surprised to realize that bias can be positive. For example, if you graduated from the same university I did, I'm more likely to think, oh, you're pretty smart. With a clearer understanding of the meaning and definition of unconscious bias, we can gain an appreciation how bias might impact the decisions that we make and the interactions we have with others. We can move to the next two slides. That's good. There we go. So where do the biases come from? Well, obviously, it's all part of our socialization. As a social psychologist, this is what I've been studying most of my life. I mean, our biases are really an amalgam of all the things that we've learned and experienced. We've learned unconscious biases through the media and our parents and our culture and interactions with others, or messages we've gotten from our friends. The messages are all around us and become part of our unconscious thinking, even without us realizing it. This is why it's so critical to be consciously exposed to diverse groups. If you're consciously exposed to diverse groups and there's an intent to learn about each other, it can be very successful. But since biases tend to be the norm and are problematic, why do we have them? Well, to a large degree, it's unfortunately due to the way our brain functions. It functions as a prediction machine to seek the simplest path to conclusions, and it's wired for threat. Yes, biases help us to make quick, if inaccurate, decisions. If you have a brain, you have biases. Our unconscious brain can overrule our best intentions. Human survival required that we were able to make quick decisions whether somebody was safe or not. I mean, as a species, we've been around 300,000 years, about 10,000 generations. During most of that time, we only stayed within our own small family or our tribe, always fearful of the others because they could be dangerous. And so the fear part of our brains is much larger and actually stronger than other parts of our brain. It's been around a lot longer. If you go into an MRI test and you're shown a photo of somebody who looks like you, there's increased activity in the reward center of the brain. When we think about people in our group, the neural pathways that are used to think about people in our group are the same as what we use when we're thinking about ourselves. In other words, when we see somebody who looks like us and we're in an MRI, the tests show that we're more empathetic to people who look like us. Think about that in terms of decision making, more empathetic. The neocortex, which is the higher form of the brain, is lit up when you see somebody who's like you. We're more empathetic to the person, and we're more willing to be reflective about them. The neocortex is important for inclusion and empathy. It's responsible for creating oxytocin, which is called the love hormone, and this helps to build trust. Researchers say if you hug a significant other for 10 times a day, it produces a significant amount of oxytocin. So I recommend you hug somebody 10 times a day to produce that oxytocin. Organizations that have high trust factors outperform those with low trust factors. So in a recent program I did in Germany, where there were about 180 senior German executives in the audience, I told them about oxytocin and I made them all stand up and hug one another. It was a bit risky, but what the heck, I have nothing to lose. Anyway, they hugged each other and they started laughing and applauding because it's the first time they ever hugged anybody at work. So yeah, we produced a lot of oxytocin right there. The opposite side is when you're shown a photo of somebody who's different from you, the fear and threat areas of the brain activate, and we have difficulty being empathetic. We're unconsciously indifferent to their success or their failure. The amygdala, an almond-shaped set of neurons deep in the temporal mode, has emerged as the key region in bias research. It's the part of the brain that reacts to fear and threat. Scientists have found the correlation between amygdala activity and implicit racial bias. Research into the amygdala suggests that part of implicit bias involves classical fear conditioning, a process in which something neutral elicits fear because we've learned to associate it with something bad. When activated, adrenaline is produced and cortisol, which is called the stress hormone, is produced. Quite the opposite of oxytocin. There's not a question about who's a good person or a bad person because there's no way we can know every truth about every culture or every stranger. Our brains are wired to make quick categorizations to compartmentalize the information coming at us. And our brains look for what's familiar to us. If someone is more like you, they're good. And if somebody's not more like you, you have the threat. It allows us to navigate the world. But it's also dangerous. Daniel Kahneman, who was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics, developed the term think fast and think slow, which is often referred to as System 1 and System 2 thinking. Thinking fast relies on your common assumptions and emotions. It's the first thing that comes to your mind. It's less rational. Thinking slow requires that you thoughtfully consider the situation using all of the data available. It requires more effort, so we're less inclined to use it. We need to always be consciously using our higher brain to overcome the easy paths of prejudice. All right, so we're going to do a quick little test now. It's going to be very fast, but I want you to quickly think to yourself and say out loud to yourself, what color are the following lines of text? Please say it quickly to yourself. Okay, let's go to the second one. Second slide. All right, now, what colors are the following lines of text? Read it out loud. Now, probably some of you read green as number one, but obviously the color was brown. So what's going on with our brains? You know, we're trying to quickly connect words and ideas with something we're familiar with. And this is how our brains work. So it's, again, a very quick little test to see, you know, how our brains look for congruity. So how do we overcome unconscious bias? Well, not too long ago, orchestra leaders who were almost always male believed that the French horn could only be played by a male, primarily because it was heavy. Today, most orchestras conduct auditions for new candidates behind curtains so that those evaluating the musician cannot tell their gender. This resulted in a 45% increase in the number of women selected into major philharmonic orchestras, including women who play the French horn. Those doing the selecting said that they had no bias, but they clearly had blind spots. And we all have blind spots, like the blind spots we have when we're driving. These are the biases we don't know we possess and are beyond our awareness. So what I ask you to think about is what blind spots you might have. What about your colleagues, your coworkers, or your family members? Today we understand that bias is unconscious and largely unintentional. Unconscious biases influence our actions every day without us realizing it. Sometimes these mental shortcuts cause us to make inaccurate assumptions about people, influencing the way we treat them and the decisions we make about them. This impacts all interpersonal interactions. Think about this. While less than 4% of American men are over 6 feet 2 inches tall, more than 36% of corporate CEOs are over 6 foot 2 inches tall. Do you think that people are consciously looking to hire small, tall people as CEOs or neglecting short people? No, but the estimates are that an inch of height is worth approximately $750 a year. So you might want to, get some high heels or something. Anyway, again, shows our bias towards height. Let's look at a startling example of unconscious bias and its implications for how bias impacts our judgments of people. So first I want to begin with a little story. This is one of the examples I think is most profound. And I'll borrow the story from NPR. Late one night, a man searches for something in the parking lot. He's on his hands and knees, and he's crawling around in a bright circle of light created by the street lamp overhead. A woman passes by, stops, and takes in the scene. "What are you looking for? Can I help?" Well, the man says, "I'm looking for my car keys. Any chance you've seen them?" She said, "Oh, you dropped them right around here?" He said, "Oh, no, I dropped them way over there," he said, gesturing to some vague area far away on the other side of the parking lot. So she asked, "Then why are you looking here?" And the man said, "Well, this is where the light is." And this analogy is what happens when we think about bias. So let me give you the example from this research. This research was done by a group of Yale researchers called the Yale Child Study Team. At a big annual conference for pre-K teachers, the researchers recruited 135 pre-kindergarten educators to watch a few short videos. Here's what the researchers told them. "We are interested in learning about how teachers detect challenging behavior in the classroom. Sometimes this involves seeing behavior before it even becomes problematic. The video segments you're about to view are of preschoolers engaging in various activities. Some clips may or may not contain challenging behaviors. Your job as a pre-K teacher in this study is to press the enter key on the external keyboard every time you see a behavior that could become potentially a challenge. So look for anything that could potentially become a challenge. Each video included 4 children, a black boy, a black girl, a white boy, and a white girl. And what the teachers did not know was that there were no challenging behaviors. So while the teachers watched the videos, unknown to them, there was eye scanning technology being used to measure the trajectory of the teachers' retinas. They wanted to know when teachers expected their behavior, who did they watch? And as some of you, I'm sure, already imagined, the teachers looked more immediately at the black children more than the white children, and they looked specifically more at the black boy. So think about the implications for this for a moment. Again, I think it's pretty profound. It's not just simply the fact that, in the U.S. Department of Education, reports that black children are 3.5 times more likely to be suspended from preschool than white children. Or put another way, black children account for roughly 19% of the population, but nearly half of the preschoolers who get suspended. The issue is really, if you look for something in one place, that's the only place you're going to find it. And what does this say about racial profiling? What does this say about the self-fulfilling prophecy? For those of you new to the field, I recommend strongly that you look up the blue-eyed, brown-eyed study done by Jane Elliott. It's very profound also, a great learning lesson. We're currently doing unconscious bias training for a major financial publication. And in preparing for it, I went back to one of my favorite authors, which is Walter Lippmann. Walter Lippmann was a journalist, and he was the first person to identify the term stereotype. And what Walter Lippmann said is, we define first, then we see. We don't see first and then define. So I think it's, again, profoundly important that what we look for, we tend to see. And that sometimes has a lot of impact because biases decide how we're going to interpret the situation. We're going to look at 3 major types of bias, unconscious bias, and possible mitigation. The 3 types of bias that we're going to look at is affinity bias, confirmation bias, and systemic bias. I will first take a look at affinity bias. What do you think affinity bias is? What comes to mind? human beings are attracted to people who are like themselves. And they view people who are similar to them more positively. Yes, similarities. This is affinity bias. For example, I can implicitly trust somebody because they go to the same church as I. Yeah, community. These are all parts of birds of a feather. We automatically, trust and have empathy for those people who are like us. Those who are not like us, we have less empathy for. This unconscious bias can be based on religion, region, race, gender, nationality, accent, and more. Affinity bias can occur in all people decisions. To overcome an affinity bias, we recommend that you reach out to others who are different from you and look for commonalities. Look for commonalities around other topics, such as children or sports or movies or hobbies. So reach out to people who are different and find out what you have in common with them. Some companies, for example, are removing the names and other identifying factors from resumes, which helps them to reduce the possibility of affinity bias. That's, again, a very good way to make some progress in this area. Let's look at the next type of bias, which is called confirmation bias. And if you take a look at the slide, I think you get a pretty good idea of what's involved here. In confirmation bias, we look for information that supports our views, and we ignore information that does not. If we're told by a friend that a new employee is very smart, we're likely to explain away any mistake they might make because our assumption is that they're smart. If we're told by a friend that a new employee is a poor performer and they make a mistake, we're going to be much less forgiving. Again, this all is confirmation bias. Imagine that a person holds the belief that left-handed people are more creative than right-handed people. Whenever this person encounters a person who is both left-handed and creative, they place greater importance on this evidence because it supports what they already believe. This individual might even seek proof that further backs up their beliefs while discounting examples that do not support the idea. Now, instead of left-handedness, let's think about confirmation bias on someone's age, religion, gender, or race. You can see how easy it is for evidence to confirm a bias. So again, this is a very, very common, unfortunate situation that confirmation bias impacts how people gather information, also how they interpret and how they recall information. For example, people who support or oppose a particular issue, let's say like gun control, will only seek out information to support it. They will also interpret news stories in a way that upholds their existing ideas. As a social psychologist, we always talk about selective exposure, selective perception, and selective retention. And again, all based on our existing biases. How can we reduce confirmation bias? Anyone have any ideas out there? How to reduce confirmation bias? Put your ideas in chat. Looking for new, absolutely. John, thank you. Have someone who's not, yep, recognize and become aware of it. Exactly. Any others? Be aware of your strongly held beliefs. Reflect. Talk and get to know people from the other side. Exactly. Question. Talk with people who disagree with you. Exact. Perfect. Yeah, so we always say, yeah, exactly. Assume positive intent. We have all these great ideas. We should be writing a book about this collectively. Yeah, what we say is, if you're in a group, well, we got a lot of good ideas here. That's great. What I say is to get other perspectives, especially with people who disagree with you. So if you're in a group, a meeting, let's say in a corporate or organizational setting, and everyone seems to agree, appoint somebody to become a devil's advocate, just to show you your blind spots. So thank you all for those great ideas. I appreciate it very much. And let's turn to the third form of unconscious bias, which is systemic bias. Probably the hardest to treat, simply because it is endemic, it's built right into the structures. So systemic biases are biases that are built into the system of how we operate. For example, you may be sending recruitment teams to the same schools every year. This can have a significant impact on new ideas and creativity. Another example is that we may use standard test scores that are biased against those people who speak English as a second language. Systemic biases can be eliminated by exploring new systems in how we identify and judge new candidates. Google, for example, stopped recruiting exclusively from Ivy League colleges, and as a result, innovation and creativity went up. The number of women rising to executive levels at IBM was very low. Then they realized that one of the factors for promotion to the executive level was being granted patents. And most female employees of IBM had little mentoring regarding the patent process. So the Women's Affinity Group at IBM created a course on how to apply for patents with IBM support. And within a year, over 60 women who attended the course were awarded patents that brought IBM millions of dollars of revenue and increased the pool of women who would be promoted to executive levels. This is what we mean by systemic bias. So what systems might you or your organization might be using, or organizations you're aware of, that may unintentionally be keeping the best talent from achieving its full potential? So any ideas out there also about how to eliminate systemic bias that you've experienced? Again, taking names off of resumes, where you recruit. Any other ideas? Seek feedback about current practice? Absolutely, especially seeking feedback from underrepresented groups. Yep, take all characteristics off of resumes. Yep. Performance management systems that only value Western ideas of leadership. Thank you, Jill. We're going to be getting into that in a little bit. Okay, let's move on to Leslie, Heather. Look for potential rather than experience. Yeah, but you have to put your biases away before you can do that. Let's look at the next topic here, which is about micro-inequities and micro-affirmations. I just want to call everyone's attention to this. I know many of you delivered this training already and aware of the concept, but for those who are new, this is a very important area for exploration. Micro messages can take the form of body language or tone of voice, facial expressions, or word choice. They're barely noticeable expressions of bias for or against somebody or something, and they're deeply rooted in the subconscious. The offender may not even be aware of the bias that's being expressed. These are all things that we have experienced or have done to others. They may not seem like big things, but they can have lasting negative impact on people. And mountains are made up of molehills. Micro-inequities, again, they're tiny, they're small, unintentional biases. And again, it can be related to any part of somebody's identity, their age, their race, their religion, their gender, their appearance, accents, and so on. These are all things we either experience or have done to others. So what I'd like you to do is, in the chat room, could you please indicate any other examples that you might know of that are examples of micro-inequities? And please put that in chat. Maybe something you've experienced yourself. Eye contact, only for white men. Mm-hmm. May I touch your hair? Using cell phones when certain team members are speaking. Yeah, it's called phubbing is the term. It means phone snubbing. I have an article on phubbing. What an interesting name, type of handshake. We're getting a lot of them. Yeah, we assume it's a him, it's a boss. Ideas ignored until a man says it. You know, your English is so good. Your name is Japanese. Avoiding contact. You don't sound French. All right. So we have lots of examples. I'm glad that we're collecting some of these. You hold your age well. Yeah. I hope you're not talking about me. Okay, let's continue. These are all great examples. And so, yeah, you're so eloquent for a black person. Yeah, very, very. Again, you can see how, unfortunately, common these all are. Or you're articulate. Yes. Okay, so let's look at this particular area of unconscious bias and interculturalism. And this is really special for me because I don't get to talk about this too often. So I really like the opportunity to discuss the intersection of culture, language, unconscious bias. And I'll focus on 3 areas, but I want to open this up for a lot of discussion. Things went south. Thank you, John. Yeah. So let's look at how this connects interculturalists and unconscious bias. The first area I want to address is what I'll call global diversity. Interculturalists are uniquely positioned and sensitive to the diversity of diversity. We understand implicitly that diversity and inclusion may mean different things in different cultures. Because of this, Global Dynamics created the Global Diversity Group on LinkedIn. And I invite all of you who are interested in global diversity to join the Global Diversity LinkedIn group. Global Dynamics is also the co-creator of the Charter for Global Diversity. And the Charter for Global Diversity is a free resource available to anybody who wants to think about taking their diversity projects global. And it's mostly made up of diversity leaders, but it's a Google document and you can add your own concepts or ideas to it, best practices, challenges, etc. Interculturalists recognize that critical dimensions of diversity will vary considerably across cultures. Secondly, interculturalists, by the very nature of our field, explore how cultural differences can impact our unconscious biases. I mean, that's what we do. We explore the impact of cultural values on behavior and, of course, on unconscious bias. So, for example, on a conference call, and if an American subordinate questions the proposal of their Chinese-based leader, who's Chinese, the American may very well be perceived as less respectful and even insubordinate by their leader. On the other hand, if a Chinese subordinate does not challenge their boss, who's Dutch, again, if a Chinese subordinate doesn't challenge their Dutch boss, the Chinese subordinate may be seen as not being a good contributor to the team, because by Dutch standards, a good participant challenges their leader, questions them. And if you don't challenge your leader, then the leader thinks, well, maybe I'm not doing a good job as a leader because people aren't comfortable challenging me. Interculturalists would ask, what role might face-saving, for example, be in unconscious bias? Obviously, face-saving could be critical in judging other people. How might the use of US-based simulations influence the selection of candidates for leadership positions. We've seen that happen a lot because there are unconscious biases built into the simulations a lot of companies use to decide who should be a good leader. And as a result, they choose bad leaders for different locations because they're using a Western model of leadership. We've delivered unconscious bias training in multiple countries. And so, for example, in China, one of the things we discovered is that when you deliver unconscious bias training there, there's really no sense of political correctness. There were comments like, oh, there are too many women engineers are on my team. This would be very openly discussed, or women don't have the same intellect as men. This was actually stated publicly in our China programs. There's much less awareness of unconscious bias and its impact on engagement, productivity, etc. And partly that's due to the homogeneity in China. But in China, there still was categories of discrimination and bias. One was around sexism, as you can just see. One was around ageism. And an important one, maybe the most important one, was affinity bias around which university you attended, and also whether or not you were from rural areas or from Shanghai or Beijing. There was a lot of unconscious bias around people who were from the rural areas versus those people who came from Shanghai or Beijing. Again, there's something built right into Chinese society that gives you advantages coming from the big cities. So that as a result, there's bias there. One difference from the US was that in China, there was much less self-disclosure. People didn't want to talk about themselves, whereas in the US, participants openly discuss things like experiences they've had with unconscious bias. In our work in Saudi Arabia, there was bias based on the degree of religiosity of the employees. So people who are very religious had biases against those who were less religious, and those who were less religious had biases towards those who were more religious. Again, difference based on the culture. And lastly, I'll mention linguistic ability and unconscious bias. Now, what is the impact of accents on our perceptions of others? Interculturalists would look at this issue. Research has shown that people are less likely to trust the same message if given by somebody with an accent. Even if you're made aware of that, it still comes out that if you hear a message from somebody with an accent, you're less trustworthy of it, even though you've been told about that bias. Of course, we know that accents directly impact the selection of candidates for a job, for example. As interculturalists, we can help our clients understand the impact of linguistic ability on unconscious bias. So what I'd like you to do now is I'd like to hear your input. Write down in chat why you think unconscious bias is important to interculturalists, or what is the link between interculturalism and unconscious bias. Yes, we all have accents. Thank you, Patricia. I certainly do. I have my Jersey City accent. What other ways do you find that interculturalism is tied to unconscious bias? Expectations. Yep. Our beliefs before starting with self-awareness. Yeah, self-awareness is where it all begins. We always begin unconscious bias training with the self-awareness question, so people can become sensitive to that. To do our work, we need to have an evolving awareness of our own biases, I'm sure. Intentionality. What I value, you may not value. Absolutely. Like speaking up. Negative stereotypes of those not doing intercultural work. Well, of course. Expectations that immigrants assimilate to dominant culture. Yep. That's certainly a bias that we have. Any others from our interculturalists out there? Executives locating to a culture where her native tongue is spoken. Yep, that's definitely a bias again. Help people build bridges and acknowledge. Amen to what Naomi said. Any others? Intergenerational trauma imputes us. That's a good one. Okay, so there's quite a lot of good ideas. Again, I would ask you to think about what interculturalism in particular can do to bring greater awareness about unconscious bias and how we can incorporate those into any training programs that we deliver. When it comes to delivering programs, I think what's critical is to keep it as real as possible. I know that whenever we deliver training, we do an awful lot of pre-work. Very often, we do detailed interviews to capture actual cases. For one of our clients, we actually captured 120 different cases of unconscious bias. You know, and then we can use those cases right in the program. So an example is the one that you have up there. This was from one of our clients that wrote, men who are assertive and strongly voice their opinions are viewed and treated differently than women who exhibit the same behavior. And then we can take that and then turn that into a discussion, put people to small groups, which is what we often do. Again, we may have 10 or 15 examples, and we'll put people to small groups to discuss these and then come up with solutions. And it can be very, very positive because people actually come away with ideas about how they can change their own behavior. So this is critical. We always begin with action plans, by the way, and we have people write down what they intend to do as a result of the program. And these can be very, very powerful. In one of those articles I mentioned earlier, proving the critics wrong on the impact of diversity training, listed about 20 different things that people did differently because of the training. And this was just a short program. But, you know, things like becoming aware of biases when viewing resumes or sharing articles around core values, micro-inequities, etc. So action plans are critical. So here's some recommendations to think about as you do your own unconscious bias training. I'd always say, reach out to people who are in some way different than yourself and find commonalities. The subject matter doesn't really matter, but reaching and understanding what the person does. Think about actions you can take to prevent unconscious biases you have that might influence your relationships. Practice new behaviors that counteract the bias, which is a powerful way to challenge the bias. So try very hard to find messages that counteract the bias. We all know that changing our behaviors will challenge others' responses to us. But more importantly, when we repeatedly implement concrete behaviors that counter our biases will diminish and may eventually fade away. We also know that differences should be valued, and while at the same time we seek common ground with people who are different. Seeing others as individuals and less as members of groups can pay off in many ways. Most of all, identifying common ground breaks down the assumptions we make about others because of our biases. So with that in mind, I would like you to think about and add anything else you might have in terms of how to make it real in a training program. What you do, what is it that you do to help people look at their bias, challenges their biases, and come up with new ideas. So I'm looking for any good ideas and suggestions here. And following that, we'll go to questions and answers. But let's see what ideas people have. What have you employed that help people to either become aware of their biases? Case studies from the organization. Yes, it really makes a big difference. We do that in every one of our programs. Another thing we often do is give us an assessment for people. Break stories, yep. Start off with their recognition of their own values. Really important. Again, self-awareness and awareness of others. A lot of times we'll do an assessment where we'll ask people to list, when am I listening? When am I shutting people out? Or who am I including and who am I excluding? We have people write down the top 5 people that they include and think about who they might be excluding. Who do I praise? Who do I go to give extra work to? Ask people what surprises them can reveal hidden expectations and assumptions. Yeah. Discussion of the time when they were treated differently. Absolutely, really helpful. Journaling, meditation, the Harvard IAT test. Have leaders of the team write down the people they report. Yeah, report to them. Absolutely. Very powerful assessment tool. Now, who do you go to for ideas? Willingness to go to first. Students with more trust. Trust me as an expert. Yeah, we tend to look at people who we think like us. Always include belief systems, religion in my presentations. From Naomi. All great ideas. Again, any kind of assessment that does that asks people to think about, who I might be overlooking. Who do I go to give a stretch promotion or project so they can be nominated to a higher level. All of these things are part of our biases. Okay, timing is just perfect. Any other ideas? I've given ourselves some time now for Q&A. And while I want to open it up to everybody to send in any questions, at the same time, I'm happy to have those of you listening in answer the questions through chat as well. So what questions do people have regarding unconscious bias training? Okay, so how did we handle the China training? Well, again, first of all, we had a China specialist who works in China and knows Chinese culture very well as Western culture, deliver the training. So they did it in a culturally sensitive manner. So they were aware of the nuances about things like hierarchy. They understood the gender issues that were going to be there. They understood the urban versus rural biases that existed. So again, it was all put in the context for Chinese to be able to relate to the topic, because in this particular case, it was a Western company. And the Western company had their own definitions of bias and inclusion, which of course wouldn't have fit into China because China is much more homogeneous. So we had to make sure that our definition was much broader. How many sessions does your training program usually involve? Again, it depends on the client. Ideally, it would be good to have 2 sessions, because in one session you have discovery, and then between session 1, session 2, people write down what they've now observed and what they can do about it. So, for example, we'll often make the point out that men interrupt women more than women interrupt men. So while that may be a fact, people may not be aware of it. So when we do a 2-part training, we can have people actually keep score and record if men interrupted women more or women interrupted men more. And then they can bring that back to the next next session. So, but most clients, they only want to have one session. I have to, say that that's the norm, even though it's not what we recommend. So, and the length of that, it really depends. It can be anywhere from 2 90-minute webinars, which is the shortest we would ever do, or amounting to also a half a day. Ideally, we always recommend at least a minimum of a full day to do any training. And I do have an article on best practices on unconscious bias training, and I'll give you a link later. Anyone who wants a copy of any of my articles, we have hot links to it, and be able to get you those. Yeah, we'll just send me a quick email at the end, and I'll make sure we'll send you the list of articles. We have intercultural articles as well as unconscious bias training articles. But let's get some more questions now. What questions do people have out there? Okay, what are your metrics for successful training? That's a great question. Okay, let's do that one, then keep a record of the other one. Metrics are critical. Again, you can help an organization measure the differences in salaries, for example, between men and women over time, the number of women who are promoted in an organization. So there are absolutely metrics out there, but because of the short-term nature of a lot of these interventions, we tend to measure the success of the program by the action plans that people commit to. And not only do we collect the action plan, so each person has to write down an action plan, and then they send it to us, and we put them into peer groups, coaching groups. And so they have to write down their action plan and say, okay, over the next 3 months or 6 months, I am committing myself to do this. And then they have to be in a small peer group, and they have to contact each other, stay in touch with each other to see how they're carrying out their action plans. So, it becomes something very simple that even the CEO of a large corporation said, one of my action plans is to go back home and tell my son to make sure that he understands and sees his mother as a valuable working person. Now, that came out of the CEO stating that publicly of a multi-billion-dollar company. Move towards more sponsorship than mentorship for women who can be promoted. This is again from a CEO. Consciously interact with more people not in my image or likeness. Use a weekly checklist at the end of the week, asking myself, am I staying consciously inclusive? So those are some of the action plans, just again, from just the CEO of a company that they're publicly committing to. And that person is going to, again, be in a team where they'll be checking on each other. Well, there were some other ideas that came up or questions because I wasn't capturing all of them.
So Neal, there's a lot of them here, and I'd like to go back to one that you partially answered before from Christy Ward. She asked how do you avoid having a shortened unconscious bias training do more harm than good? So what are some of the things, if a company only wants like a half day or 2-hour program, how can we as trainers make sure that it's not going to do more harm than good?
Yeah, this is a critical part of how we decide if we're going to take on a client or not. There's got to be a commitment to follow up. You can actually do more damage than good, as you suggested, because what's happening is you're raising people's expectations. Now we're going to be less biased. But, when the behavior doesn't change, then people get really frustrated and are more likely even to leave the organization. So there has to, again, that's why we concentrate so much on these action plans. People have got to, commit to do things. You know, again, if they're not following up, I mean, the results I'm giving you are actually from a half-a-day program. And, you know, we had literally hundreds of responses from these executives. I mean, I can read you a few. Include Women's Committee for Campus Recruiting on Career Fairs. Again, ensure we have an inclusive process from recruiting for those plum jobs to obtaining perspectives at exit interviews. Again, this was from the result of the program. Make sure we test for unconscious bias when we do our exit interviews. So you have to have people committing to do something and then doing it. Ideally, again, with our clients, we have them capture the action plans and then they publish like a newsletter, so on, reporting all the action plans that people have committed to, not necessarily naming the people, but then following up with cases. So people have to see that there's a commitment by the organization to make long-term change. If it's a one and done kind of a thing, we don't do it, simply because we know that that's not going to lead to structural change. So we work very closely with the Chief Diversity Officer and their team to make sure that the unconscious bias training is a part of a much larger initiative. It's not the only thing. It's just to check the box, it's not going to work. We don't want to waste their time and our time either. I don't have enough time to commit to that. Only if we can make long-term sustained change is it worth doing. Other questions, Dana?
Yes, thank you, Neal, for that. And I think that's a good segue into answering this question from Brett Perry, who says, how do you guide an organization in encouraging their employees to attend and counteract bias against bias training itself?
Wow, that's a good question. You know, there's very little you can do to undo the bias that people might have about this training. Unfortunately, the best outcome for me always is that the business case for diversity, that when you do diversity training, what you're doing, you're not, unconscious bias training rather, what you're doing is you're helping people make more rational decisions, which will make you a better leader, make you more productive. And so when you can make a rational decision, that's again more practical, that's going to be more profitable, make you a more successful manager and leader. That's the end. That's your takeaway. The takeaway is I'm going to be a better leader. I'm going to be a better manager. I'll be a better mother or father or sister or brother. I'll be a better neighbor because I'm going to make rational decisions, because I'm becoming aware of the biases so that I can stop and hit the pause button before I make a decision and think about, is my bias influencing my behavior? So there's no easy way, but I would say you have to go back to the business case and why it's important, because people will understand that, I hope.
Good, thank you. Here's another question, Neal. From Ricardo Flores, how do you deal with consciously biased, ethnocentric, and openly bigoted individuals in your training sessions, especially when they're required to attend these sessions?
I would ask the person to see me after the program and perhaps, I mean, look, I'm at the point now in my career that I can openly confront them. So it's you know, why do you have that idea? You know, are all people, I mean, if they say something openly bigoted and you say, well, do you know any people who are from that group who are not like that? I mean, you can openly confront them. Again, I have no problem. Yeah, confront them with honey. Yeah, Patricia, you got lots of honey. You're much sweeter than I am, Patricia. Yeah, I certainly, let me just give you one comment that was told to me by the Chief Diversity Officer for a major pharmaceutical, and she happens to be an African-American senior woman executive, lots of experience in this field, and we co-delivered a session, and her one comment that she said at the session, which meant so much to me, was, I like working with Neal because he doesn't give me any bullshit. You know, you tell it like it is. So if somebody's openly bigoted, you have to call them out on it. Where do you think you got those ideas from? And what is the impact of having that idea in terms of you making good judgments about people? At the end of the day, again, if they're openly bigoted, it's gonna have a negative impact on how they're perceived and how they're treated and whether they get promoted, etc.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Time for more?
Yep. We have 5 more minutes. Yep.
Okay, great. I'm going to give you this question from Patricia Coleman. She says, Neal, she doesn't use D&I as a title anymore because the word inclusion is disliked. People feel pressured. How do you feel about that?
Since the goal of our organization is to create globally inclusive organizations, yeah, inclusion is, look, inclusion is what it's about. You know, diversity, as I said, is just about numbers. It's you know, it doesn't make the organization change unless you want inclusion. So anyone who's defensive about inclusion, I'd be curious to know what they think the inclusion means. It means, you know, allowing everybody a seat at the table, listening to people, having greater engagement of people. So I've not heard, you know, too many people come up with concerns about the term inclusion. We put that up front right away. As I said, you know, diversity is reality, but inclusion is the choice. You have to choose to be inclusive. You have to do something about it. Yeah, some companies promote minority. Yeah. People fear change. Inclusion is scary. Again, it's only scary to people, you know, who think they're going to lose something and not gain something. And so inclusion has to be seen as something that's a positive. It makes you a better person. It makes you more aware. They say diversity and belonging. Yeah, we talk a lot about belonging. And in fact, that's one of the questions we ask in the training is, you know, who do you think feels they don't belong here? And you have an open discussion about that. It's a better way of saying, who do you think is discriminated against? But who do you think doesn't belong here? Belonging is a really good concept to use. Some other questions, Dana?
Sure. Let's see. How do you work directly with microaggressions with ideas of how to deal with them when they occur?
Yeah, that again, a great idea. We use simulations a lot. And so we, for example, we'll have a simulation where a manager and subordinate are meeting and the manager is given some microaggressions to demonstrate. And then we, you know, openly talk about it within the group. You know, so what do you do when you've experienced this? How do you react to it? What can you say about it? So we try to give people the tools of what to say. Of course, you know, there's that whole thing about, you know, the I statement versus the you statement. You know, I feel, you know, disrespected when you take an idea that I had and you claim it for your own. Or I feel that you're not calling on me because I'm young or old. So again, there are ways of discussing it without being very strongly confrontational, but rather saying, this is how I feel. This is what I'm experiencing. We have time probably for 1 or 2 more.
Okay, so from Naomi Ludman Smith, I'd like to go back to questions about racism. How do you address racism, power, and privilege in education and training?
Well, we need another webinar for that one. And I don't mean to want to dismiss that at all. It's absolutely critical. And again, we take another whole session to talk about it. What I would say is, again, when I was teaching in the university, I was teaching in a university when I first started teaching there. It was predominantly first-generation college students, almost all white ethnic, working class, almost all males. Again, so they tend to be Irish, Polish, Italian, etc. And one of the requirements I had for my course was that they had to all read the autobiography of Malcolm X. And the point, of course, of that was to, get them to get a sort of a gut reaction, feel to his experience of racism, his sense of self-being, well-being, his sense of himself as a black person based on how the society defined him. And so obviously that can then lead to power, etc. If we do sometimes, we're sometimes asked to do programs on power and privilege, and so we have activities specifically around that. One of the best ones is Star Power, which is a great simulation, which was created, I think, by the same person who did Bafa Bafa. But Sandy's the expert on those simulations more so than I am.
But I think we'll end on this one if you want to. It's from
Right.
Denoville, and it's a good way to surmise what we're talking about here. She says, we already talk about generalizations and stereotypes in cross-cultural training. Should we talk about unconscious bias instead?
Ever since I started doing, both. I started off in diversity, then went to intercultural, and now I'm back doing diversity and intercultural. I mix them up. I really do. When I teach a intercultural course, I always bring in the concept of bias. I always bring in the concept of the brain making quick decisions, because it influences how we perceive other cultures as well. So, absolutely, I think it can be discussed. I don't think it should be, I don't think you should exclude intercultural. I think intercultural is absolutely critical, but having bias is all part of intercultural. Again, if you look at the social psychology behind others, again, the whole research on others, the original research by Zimmel and others, the research is how do I perceive others and why do I perceive others differently, and what are my behaviors based on my perception of them. So that's intercultural, and it's also unconscious bias together. So that is a good, perhaps near final question. I do want to say that I'll be happy to answer any other questions that we did not cover. And I know that this is being recorded, so you'll be able to listen to it at another time. I want to make sure that all of you that are coming to Atlanta come by and say hello. I'll be there. I have a session on Friday, November 1st, at room 5. So you can see me there or anywhere else at the conference. Look me up. Also, if you'd like the list of the articles on unconscious bias and intercultural training, I'd be very happy to send those to you. They're hot linked. It's a hot link list, so you can go into it and download any of the articles you want to read at your leisure. I promise you they'll help put you to sleep real quickly, but I hope you'll find some value in them as well. And I want to thank everyone for their participation in this. I know it's a group activity, and so many of you unseen in the background, helpful in getting this up and going. And again, I want to just thank you. Sandy, if you're still on, I don't know if you have any final comments you want to make.
Yes, I do, Neal. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank you on behalf of everybody for this incredible webinar. You really walked us through not only helping us clarify what unconscious bias is, but how it affects the people we work with and the kinds of things we can do to make people conscious of unconscious bias and take it out of the unconscious and then be able to deal with it in terms of their own personal and professional interactions with others. I want to thank Stacy for her idea about having a webinar on racism. I think that would be a very good idea. I have written it down. We will take that and see what we can do with it. I wanted to say also that you were absolutely right that Gary Schertz is the man who did both Star Power and Bafa Bafa. And I also wanted to say that your session on Friday morning is going to be in Salon A. We decided that we needed to give the rooms their names, not just a number. And so you'll be in Salon A, and anybody who's there will be getting a beautiful printed program in which they can look up the actual room names of the various sessions to find the one that they want to attend. So thank everybody for joining, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. And look for the next webinar. It's going to be in November, shortly after the conference, about a week and a half after the conference. In any case, it is Rita Wibler talking about leadership. And I know that's going to be another good one. Thanks again, Neal. It was great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. And good luck in promoting inclusion in your organizations.